Thank you very much, Carl. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Well, thank you to the Council of State Governments for putting on this forum and allowing me to present on public-private partnerships. And we can flip to the next slide. And as Tom alluded to in his presentation, there are many different flavors of P3s or public-private partnerships. And our organization, Social Finance, which is a 10-year-old 501c3 nonprofit, has been a pioneer of a space called Pay for Success. And the roots of this kind of movement is really built on public-private partnerships, specifically looking at public-private partnerships in the human social services realm, so not in the built environment as much as though we're starting to get into that space. That's one big differentiator of the work that I'll be talking about is the focus on human and social services. The second is the linchpin of the public and private partnerships that I'll be talking about via Pay for Success is really around measurable outcomes. So a lot of our work all of our work is really at the nexus of how do we improve lives of individual is kind of one focus. Second is how do we align and improve systems such that we are able to get better outcomes for every dollar spent, specifically taxpayer dollars. And through this work of building these public-private partnerships over the last 10 years, we started our public sector practice 5 years ago, really to bring a lot of the tools under the Pay for Success umbrella directly to the hallways of government of how do we better align funding, procurement, programmatic and policy decisions with outcomes-based solutions, data-driven government, and performance management. And if we can flip to the next slide, we work with governments across many different states throughout the country and answer a bunch of different questions. And then these are some of the flavor of those questions. Some questions are, how do we best identify the programs that we can invest in that are preventative in nature, that will produce meaningful outcomes and save cost in the long term, specifically budgetary cost is one type of question. Another type of question is how do we think about braiding different funding streams together, both within the public sphere, but also the private sphere in order to get to scale and shift away risk, as Tom alluded to, is one of the big benefits of P3s. And then last, how do we move our systems away from compliance management on just counting how many people are getting served to really performance management? In our experience, the implementation science is an area of significant improvement where we can get better yield in terms of dollars spent and outcomes created. And so there's kind of 4 core principles under Pay for Success. If we can switch to the next slide, I can highlight those. Thank you. That undergirds all our work at Social Finance. The first is how do we clearly define the outcomes that we want to achieve? Second is how do we use data and information historically to make the wisest investments that gives us the best probability of achieving the outcomes? Third is how do we develop cross-sector partnerships? If we're going to get at some of these gnarly issues that we're facing as states and communities, we're really going to have to think about collaborating across sectors. And then fourth, as I alluded to earlier, how do we create better, stronger, and faster feedback loops in our process to make sure what's working, double down on those, and also identify what's not working so we can take budget away from that and put it to programs that work. There are a lot of different ways that we take these principles and put them into concrete projects. The one that I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking to today is the Social Impact Bond, which is a public-private partnership. At its core, it's a financing mechanism that is intended to deliver better human outcomes. And if we can flip to the next slide, I can. The concept is pretty elegant in nature, not as easy to put together. But the concept is this: we have essentially 3 parties to a social impact bond project. You have your payer positive outcomes, which is often government. This is on the bottom right-hand screen, that says I'm willing to pay X price if Y outcome is achieved. You have a group of private funders or a single private funder that's willing to put up startup capital to fund a specific service for a specific target population to achieve a specific outcome. There's an independent evaluator that measures if those outcomes are achieved, and only if those outcomes are achieved, the government pays back the private funders. So the core tenets of the social impact bond are very aligned with what Tom highlighted are the key tenets of many public-private partnerships. One is certainly about how do we shift risk away from taxpayers and onto the private sector where appropriate. It's not always appropriate. Second is how do we leverage both the capital markets as well as philanthropic funding to advance and scale policy objectives for governments. The third is how do we get better accountability to results? Many times, especially in the human and social services, government gives out funding for a specific program. They may or may not actually measure results, but even irrespective of the results, the funding goes out to the service provider. This mechanism really flips that dynamic on its head, where government only pays if certain measurable outcomes are achieved, and those outcomes are predefined at the beginning of the project and agreed to with government. So let me use a concrete example to hopefully bring this to life. If we can flip to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we worked with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts starting in the beginning of 2015, 2016, to really address a problem that they were facing. And specifically around, there was a large number of individuals, about 230,000 people in the greater Boston area that were English language learners that needed adult basic education skills. And if you peeled back as we did and looked at the data, this population had two challenges. One is that they had significantly higher rates of unemployment relative to their peers with similar credentials, but were fluent in English. And second, they had much lower earnings to the tune of $24,000 annually was the differential between individuals that are English language learners versus individuals that are proficient in English. And this obviously had dramatic impacts on individuals' ability to move up the economic ladder, but also had budgetary consequences for the state of Massachusetts, as individuals were not attaining their kind of potential from an earning standpoint. That's money on the table left in terms of taxes that are flowing into the coffers of the state. Additionally, as individuals were with lower income, were also in poverty, there's a lot of social services that the state was helping these individuals with. So there was also an increase in expenditures. So it was a double whammy of both increase in expenditures and a reduction in revenue that the Commonwealth was really looking to solve. So we came together with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the Jewish Vocational Service, which was a CBO in the greater Boston area, to put together a social impact bond that raised $12.4 million from 40 different investors to invest in services delivered by Jewish Vocational Services that were vocational and workforce education based, with the goal of serving 200 individuals that were English language learners. The Jewish Vocational Service has 4 different program tracks based on the individual's need. The first was rapid employment for individuals who needed a wage right away. Second was English for advancement. Third was vocational skills training, and the fourth was bridges to colleges. And individuals came in through JVS, Jewish Vocational Services, and based on their needs, they went to one of these tracks. And the goals of the project were threefold. First and foremost was to support limited English speakers to attain jobs, increase earnings, and transition to post-secondary education where appropriate for the individual and where desired by the individual. The second was equip individuals with the skills that employers really wanted. And so there's a skills mismatch in many parts of the country, and certainly in greater Boston, that this project was trying to fill the gap of. And then the third goal was for the Commonwealth to really deepen their focus on outcomes. So the Commonwealth has been a leader in the Pay for Success movement, and they're looking at different forums and different policy areas where they can better connect taxpayer dollars to accountability to results. And this was one additional effort in that progress to making sure that their dollars are yielding positive outcomes for individuals, but also for the taxpayers. And I'll use the next slide to kind of walk through the mechanics of how this worked. And I'm going to start from the top and go to the left. So There were 40 impact investors and a range of impact investors from financial institutions to donor advised funds to foundations that we, social finance, helped aggregate to the tune of $12.4 million. All of that funding went to the Jewish Vocational Service to provide their programming across those 4 tracks that I mentioned to 2,000 individuals. Those 2,000 individuals were served, and 3 specific outcomes were measured for each of those 3 individuals. One was their engagement with the program. What's important here is that if you don't enroll the right individuals into programs, you're not going to get impact, right? And so that first step is very important on making sure you're enrolling the right population. Second is increased earnings, and that's kind of the meta level goal that the project was trying to get to, is are we actually increasing livelihoods of individuals so they can move up the economic ladder, and we measured that. And the third was a transition to colleges for individuals who went to the Bridges to Colleges track. We had an independent evaluator measure those outcomes, and to the extent those outcomes were achieved, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts agreed to make repayments to the impact investors. What's great about this is that, again, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts only pays to the extent that outcomes are achieved. So I'm going to make up a hypothetical here. If 0 positive outcomes were achieved, meaning no one graduated from the program, no one had an increase in earnings, and no one transitioned to college, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts would owe $0 for this programming, and the investors would, in this hypothetical, lose their shirt, and they won't get any of the $12.4 million back. Thankfully, this project has actually achieved quite a bit of success. So one of the tracks was the advancement English for Achievement. And that program track had 1,000 individuals that went through that program. And the results were measured through a randomized control trial, which is known in the social services space as kind of the gold standard of evaluations. And 2 years after individuals had graduated from this program, they had earnings of $3,500 greater than their counterparts who didn't get access to the program. What was even more impressive was that individuals who had prior work experience but were unemployed at the point of enrollment, they saw in the second year, they saw a $7,000 increase in earnings based on this program, again, relative to their counterparts did not give access to this programming. So this is an example of how you can use public-private partnerships to leverage in private capital to take on risk of achieving social outcomes. It is also an ability to have a greater focus on making sure that taxpayer dollars are actually achieving outcomes. So both defining the outcomes, which is easier said than done. Second, how do we link the data system? So in this project, the agency that we are working with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, with the Department of Education. However, we had to work in conjunction with the Department of Labor in order to make sure we're getting unemployment, the wage data in order to measure the increase in earnings. So there was a lot of data connectivity that happened in the back end to allow us to measure the outcomes that were of interest. And that data not only allowed us to measure the outcomes, but also gave us real-time data as this program was up and running, that allowed us to understand at any point in time, how are we doing relative to the goals that we have set? And if we're off mark, why are we off the mark? And then course correct along the way. So one of the big benefits that we're doing with governments outside of the social impact bond structures, how do we use data on a real-time basis to improve programmatic results? Is the second big benefit that's come out of this type of public-private partnership. I'll have to say that the work the social impact bond is the product or the concept that really started the Pay for Success movement, but we evolved beyond the social impact bond. So it's still a tool that we're using with governments across the country, but it's one of a number of different ways that we're thinking about, again, having a focus on outcomes. How do we leverage in private capital to make sure that we're amplifying the impact of each dollar spent, whether that's in workforce development, whether that's in healthcare or in education, all issue areas that we're working in. And maybe I'll pause there in just the interest of time. I will throw a post into the chat as this came up earlier in the conversation. We recently co-wrote a book with the Federal Reserve banks of Atlanta and Philadelphia about workforce development. And one of the concepts in there is this pay it forward concept, which I won't get into now, but if it's of interest, we can talk about it in the question and answer period. It is, I think, a great use for stimulus funds that are coming out because it's a one-time use of funding that can go into a fund that can serve multiple cohorts of individuals over multiple years. So I know as we are talking with a lot of governments, part of the challenge is how do we deploy this money that will get to impact, but not sets up a fiscal cliff. And I think this tool could be a good use case that aligns with that objective. But let me pause there and kick it back to Carl.